Thank you for the kind introduction. In the preface to his seminal work, Remnants of Auschwitz, on the memory of the Holocaust, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben noted the following in connection with his writing process. At a certain point, it became clear that testimony contained at its core an essential lacuna. In other words, the survivors bore witness to something it is impossible to bear witness to. As a consequence, commenting on survivors' testimony necessarily meant interrogating this lacuna, or more precisely, attempting to listen to it. Agamben's words can serve as a motto for this paper, as they touch upon three of the key elements to be discussed: the historical singularity of the Holocaust, its incommunicable nature, and the inescapably fragmentary nature of memory. Since the focus here is on music, his metaphorical plea to listen to the lacuna takes the most concrete of terms. Specifically, I am interested in how music stands in relation to testimony and trauma, in the way in which it confronts the challenge of expressing the inexpressible. At the same time, to attempt to listen to the lacuna through music is also to acknowledge the special role art plays in connection with human catastrophes, and particularly with the cataclysmic history of the 20th century. The focal point is Chaya Czernovin's first opera, Pnima ins innere, which premiered in the Munich Biennale in 2000. My goal here is not to provide a detailed analysis of the work, but to suggest a few pointers for such analysis. Crucially, what I'm aiming at is less a structural understanding than a cultural semiotic. Therefore, a large portion of the discussion is dedicated to the elucidation of the context that give rise to the opera's meaning. Please note that my discussion refers to Klaus Guth's production for the Biennale, from which I will use one or two excerpts. To put it succinctly, the subject matter of Pnima ins innere is the trauma of the Jewish Holocaust. We shall see in a moment that Pnima is not a Holocaust opera. Indeed, Chaya Czernovin herself objected to this characterization. It is not an Holocaust opera in the strict sense of the term. However, to the extent that it takes the tragedy of this event as its basis and point of departure, it is inextricably entangled with the problematic nature of Holocaust representation. The uniqueness of the Holocaust as a historical event, we know, is the subject matter of numerous scientific studies, films, and artworks. In music, Schoenberg's A Survivor from Warsaw and Luigi Nono's anti-fascist works are among the most notable musical compositions to reflect on it and on its consequences. By now, the memory of the Holocaust has also been dealt with in various musical genres by a number of composers active in Israel, including Leon Shidlovsky and Eden Partush, and more. Nonetheless, for all its prominence, or perhaps exactly because of it, coming to terms with the Holocaust, musically and artistically, has remained an exceptionally daunting task, demanding not only fine compositional craft, but more importantly, that rare combination of honesty and good judgment. Czernovin's personal experience and training places her in an advantaged position to pursue this risky enterprise. Born in Haifa in 1957, her compositional output includes orchestral music as well as chamber works and 2 operas. Her music has been performed at over 50 festivals worldwide and won numerous honors and awards. Her vocal pieces are written, for the most part, to Hebrew text, and many of her instrumental works bear Hebrew titles. Her literary sources include present-day Hebrew poetry and literature, and more sources. The genesis of Pnima dates back to Czernovin's residence period in Schloss Solitude, Stuttgart, in 1996, and to an exchange with Peter Wuziczka about a possible collaboration. The result was her most ambitious work up to that point, and probably the most personal one as well. From a historical perspective, the compositional language of Pnima and its explicit subject matter reinforce each other. being rooted in the intricate dialectical connection between modernist advanced art and historical horrors. In the aftermath of World War II, writers on art and music have often commented on the new situation in which the arts have found themselves in facing the brutality of the Holocaust. Initially prompted by Theodor Adorno, who was, of course, already mentioned here several times, this discourse engaged questions of art's relationship with and commitment to truth and reality. This context is crucial to the understanding of Czernovin's creative path. Her work is self-consciously driven by the uncompromising line of 20th century radical music in deconstructing preconceived forms and exploring unfamiliar territories of sound and musical experience. Contemporary composers who influenced her work include Chelsea and Feldman, as well as Ferneyhough and Lachenmann. Stylistically, her music is defined by the juxtaposition of highly differentiated musical materials and her unique way of elaborating these by pitting them against one another. Pnima is no exception in this regard, but the explicit, albeit textless confrontation with the abnormal lends it special significance. The first bars of Pnima already bear witness to this, displaying the four solo singers in a sustained scream whisper against the instrumental background of 6 double basses, the singing saw, and the violins with blocked strings. I would like now to play a few minutes from the opera. I will not show this passage that I've just mentioned, the opening of the opera, but the last few minutes of the first of 3 scenes and the beginning of the second scene. I will say more on the content of the opera in a moment, but basically there are only 2 figures there, the child and his grandfather, or an old man. Both of them don't have text, but they confront each other in different ways. I will say more about it. think that's enough. Okay. The decision, undoubtedly a courageous one, to write an opera on the Holocaust of all subjects raises complicated questions that bring together aesthetics and ethics. The key element here is the concept of the inappropriate, which applies to art as much as to historical writing. It therefore makes a perfect sense to draw some conclusions from the comparable discussion carried out by historiographers. Perhaps surprisingly, the problem identified by these has little to do with the search for established fact about the crimes of the Nazis. It is also not directly connected to the epistemological discussion of the boundaries of legitimate interpretation. While both of these problems are relevant, the issue at stake is primarily a structural and aesthetic one. Frank Ankersmith explained, "Every discussion of the Holocaust runs the risk of getting involved in a vicious circle, where misunderstanding and immorality mutually suggest and reinforce each other. And it is only aesthetic category, the essentially aesthetic category of the inappropriate, that may enable us to avoid here the impasses to which the search for the merely true and the ethically good invariably will lead." In an important sense, modernist art has grappled with the dilemma of the appropriate from the very beginning. The appropriate in the context of art refers to the congruency between the things presented or expressed and the means employed in attaining this goal. In the first place, catastrophes and the experience of trauma were fundamental to the work of artists well before the wretched consequences of the Nazi terror were fully revealed. Indeed, in the work of modernist artists, especially around World War I, modernity itself appeared as something of a catastrophe. Moreover, already in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, expressionist art took it upon itself to depict life in its most extreme destructive state. Although used with a different emphasis and transmutation, the aesthetic position of the expressionist avant-garde has remained essential to many art movements until today. From the very beginning of modernism, radicalism of means was associated with what is extreme and abnormal about life. Well before the invention of the bombing aircraft, according to Hans Heisler, Schoenberg expressed the feeling of people in a bunker. At the very least, he tried to intimate the thought that the world was not nice, die Welt nicht schön war. Not surprisingly then, expressionist music and avant-garde music in general was often linked to the cataclysm of war. Czernovin's opera draws together 20th century art and aesthetic thought with experiences of trauma and images of catastrophe. Yet he does so in a particularly subtle manner. The opera is the first musical work to address the Holocaust from the viewpoint of the second generation, namely the sons and daughters of the survivors. Its literary source is the novel See Under Love by the renowned Israeli author David Grossman. Without delving into unnecessary details, the book is divided into 4 seemingly independent parts. The last part is a kind of dictionary that holds the key, as it were, to understanding the connection between those other parts. Czernovin's opera draws solely on the first part, called Momik. In the book, Momik is the single child of 2 Holocaust survivors. The family is joined one day by an old man, a relative, whom Momik identifies as his grandfather. In both the book and the opera, the dynamic between the 2 characters is driven by Momik's attempt to reach into the old man's traumatized world. The opera Czernovin's opera transforms Grossman's narrative into an epic statement about the universal experience of trauma and its incommunicable nature. Unusually, the opera has no singing parts for the actors and no libretto. All the music is performed by the orchestra, which includes 4 vocal soloists, 2 males, 2 females, 6 instrumental soloists, a singing saw, and a string orchestra with 6 double basses. Typical for the vocal parts are short, scattered utterances that detach the vowels from their normative origin in complete words. The fragmentation of the voice tangibly symbolizes the limitation of verbal communication. On occasion, the virtuosity of the vocal parts brings to mind Luciano Berio, sequenza number 3. The extreme means employed in Pnima serve to articulate the unbridgeable realities of its 2 protagonists. The first appearance of the old man is accompanied, the old man that also we saw on the screen, is accompanied by fast and loud knockings of the cans and stones, and the disoriented nasal glissandi of the singing saw. The overall dark sound, with the deep voices of the male singers, matches and reinforces the claustrophobic pacing of the man, who is shuttling back and forth across the stage. We saw that in the excerpts. The child, by contrast, is singled by the lighter voices of the female singers. At one climactic point, in the second scene, the child is seen dragging the fearful old man in the darkness. This episode has the clearest correlate in Grossman's book, where Momik drags the old man with him down into the basement, where he believes the Nazi beast is hiding. As a side note, David Grossman, the author himself, commented about this image of the Nazi beast, and he said it in a context that seemed to be very appropriate to this event. I quote, "As a child, I often heard the term the Nazi beast, and when I asked the adults who this beast was, they refused to tell me, and said there were things a child should not know. Years later, I wrote in See Under Love about Momik. The frightened Momik imagines the Nazi beast as a monster that controlled a land called Over There, where it tortured the people Momik loves and did things to them that hurt them forever and denied them the ability to live full life. When I was 4 or 5, I heard for the first time the name of Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter. I felt a great sense of relief. Finally, I thought, there is someone courageous enough to fight the beast, even to hunt it down. The word Pnima, inward in English, captures the intention behind the opera. In broad outlines, the opera is divided into 3 parts, reflecting different states or stages in the relationship between the child and the old man. In part 1, the old man and the child are separated, followed by a confrontation in the second part. Then the third part centers on the child and his internal process of assimilating the old man's trauma. As its title implies, the work as a whole is a journey into its 2 characters' different yet curiously overlapping worlds. The third act can be further broken into 3 parts, separated by the sustained crawling glissandi of the string, starting more or less in the middle of that scene, that take over the whole musical space and bring to a climax the seismographic streams of anxiety that underlie the opera. I would like now to show two more portions of that opera. The end of the second scene and more or less the middle of the third scene. This is where the confrontation between the two, the child and the old man, seem to get into a certain climax. This is the end of the second scene, which contains few minutes of recorded voices. Now I will show a scene where the child, as I said in the third scene, tried to create his own image of the old man's traumatized world, and now we see how it's being done in this production. The decision to relinquish spoken words was one way to extract the universal core from the uniquely historical experience of the Holocaust. From another perspective, this element has its source in a documented pattern of post-Holocaust traumatic behavior. Silence, as is well known, was one way for the survivors to cope with what they saw and experienced. In the case of Czernowin, this was first and foremost a matter of personal history. Czernowin, both of whose parents survived the Holocaust, told an interviewer that the memory of the Holocaust played a central, if not always fully recognized, role in her life as well as in her musical work. She also recalled how as a child she was haunted by the well-kept secret of her parents' past. It is easy to see why Grossman's book appealed to Czernowin, but there is, I believe, more than a personal dimension to this. In the book, Momi forms his imaginative idea of what has happened over there by the little hints he occasionally gleans from the conversations among his parents and guests. Through these, he builds an image in his mind which he refers to as Eretz Sham, the land of there or simply there. Eretz Sham can be defined as the opposite of utopia. It is, to begin with, a real place, and yet one whose horrifying reality seems to defy the possibility of meaningful communication. This is what Agamben, quoted earlier, termed the aporia of the Holocaust. I quote, "What is at issue here is not, of course, the difficulty we face whenever we try to communicate our most intimate experiences to others. The discrepancy in question concerns the very structure of testimony. On the one hand, what happened in the camps appears to the survivors as the only true thing, and as such, absolutely unforgettable. On the other hand, this truth is to the same degree unimaginable, that is, irreducible to the real elements that constitute it. Facts so real that by comparison, nothing is truer. A reality that necessarily exceeds its factual elements, such is the aporia of Auschwitz. Perhaps Adorno had something similar in mind when he declared that after Auschwitz no poem can be written, or rather that is barbaric act. Adorno subsequently changed his mind, probably as a result of his encounter with Paul Celan's Death Fugue, but his warning lost none of its haunting implications. Adorno's example of poem was intended paradigmatically. It referred to all those genres of art that originate in more peaceful times, before civilization has virtually brought itself to the point of near complete extinction. In a peculiar and unpredictable way, advanced artworks have approximated Holocaust remembrance in their attempt to give expression to an experience that exceeds its factual elements, to use Agamben's formulation. For Czernowin, this was an explicit goal that could be attained only by replacing traditional opera conventions with music of a brutal, pre-verbal, and pre-civilized-like expressive force. Nonetheless, the apocalyptic side of the avant-garde aesthetic thought is inseparably linked to other facets of her compositional process. The guiding concepts of her work, and indeed her personal life, is the fluidity and mutability of identity. Some attempts have been made to link these oft-mentioned elements of her work to Jewish music, but her approach to Judaism and identity in general seems rather to question such collectivist notions. In Pnima, the universalization of the Holocaust memory is carried out through a dense musical idiom that leaves few traces of any identifiable musical tradition. This might be seen as an additional way to avoid the pitfalls of the inappropriate, for only through such an idiom one can hope to achieve that level of expressive authenticity which allows a truly authoritative musical reconstruction of a musical trauma. To return to the metaphor with which I began, the attempt to listen to the lacuna in the testimony of Holocaust survivors finds an intriguing counterpart in Czernovin's composition. The dilemma of communicating drama is an unsolvable one, but music, as the case of Pnima demonstrates, can investigate this lacuna from its own vantage point. In view of recent diagnosis of the death of art, the work not only pays homage to the memory of the victims, it also restores the historical connection between radical art and the consciousness of catastrophe. Thank you very much.